They are the filthiest of all God's creatures. They have no modesty when it comes to defecating or urinating, and do not wash themselves when intercourse puts them in a state of ritual impurity. They do not even wash their hands after eating. Indeed, they are like roaming asses. They arrive, moor their boats by the Itil, and build large wooden houses on its banks. They share a house in groups of 10, 20, sometimes more, sometimes fewer. Each reclines on a couch. They are accompanied by beautiful female slaves for trade with the merchants. They have intercourse with their female slaves in full view of their companions. Sometimes they gather in a group and do this in front of each other. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast. Today we are looking at that very passage, which is from one of the most interesting people in the medieval world, which is Ibn Fadlan. This was written in the 920s. He was infamously a kind of delegate ambassador from Baghdad of the Abbasid Caliph, and he was traveling through Eastern Europe and came upon a group of people. These were the Bulgars, the Rus Vikings, otherwise known. And he writes during his whole journey this incredible Risala, which is his kind of journal of his journey. And that's one of the things he writes. And now what's really interesting about Ibn Fadlan is that he encapsulates this whole new topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is a multicultural medieval world. We tend to talk about everyone kind of in the medieval world, all the different topics, kind of separate in isolation to one another. We talk about French history, we talk about English history, we talk about Vikings, we talk about the Crusades, the papacy, all these different individual topics. But it's good to remember that actually these all intertwine. 793 was the first invasion of the Vikings in England. 300 years later, we have the Crusades. All these things are interconnected through each other, but history, the way that we write history tends to treat them in isolation, thematically perhaps. And so there's rare instances that actually we see these kind of borders cross. Because we have to remember, although Europe was Catholic and the Middle East was Muslim, there were many examples of both communities intermingling. Have Muslim communities in Europe, particularly Spain, and Christian communities in the Middle East, particularly around Jerusalem and Syria. And so, we have to remember that this was an interconnected world. Like nowadays, there were Africans, black people in England, and similarly, there were Scottish people in Africa. We tend to, like I say, treat these all in isolation, and so sometimes it's good to kind of, as institutions will say, to decolonize the curriculum and kind of bring all of this together, and to show that actually medieval Europe was kind of one which was interconnecting and was multicultural, and Ibn Fadlan kind of helps to represent this. So let us return back to that incredible passage that we just wrote. Quite an interesting passage, nevertheless. Now, to put it into context, Ibn Fadlan had been walking along the Silk Road. Now, this is probably infamous to many people. Tons of people probably know it. Marco Polo and all those different kind of different people to do with the Silk Road. But it was this long stretch of road, this trade route, this incredible trade route that went from China all the way across to France even, and it stopped off and there was, in kind of Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, but all the way down to places like Turkey and places in the Middle East and North Africa. So it really interconnected the world. It was a super highway of cultures. And you would find and discover many people and cultures along it, really. There's an infamous scene, a brilliant scene from, I believe it might even be the latest season of the show Vikings, where, spoilers, but Ivar the Boneless travels along the Silk Road, and you see a Viking amongst Asian people, amongst Middle Eastern people, amongst Eastern Europeans, amongst Frankish, amongst, it's just this melting pot of culture. But what you see is that the Silk Road is almost this kind of, provides these little microcosms of cultures. In their little camps, everyone's representing almost stereotypically their culture. And this is what we see with Ibn Fadlan's passage. And it provides us with some really interesting things that we can kind of look at to do with not only Viking culture, but also the way in which the perceptions of Viking culture from a Muslim and Middle Eastern perspective. Because typically we look at, in past I've looked at Sujet, Guibert of Nogent, Galbert of Bruges, Thomas of Monmouth. These are very white, English, Frankish people. So it's interesting to now look at something from a Muslim and Arab perspective. So many historians have had kind of a preoccupation of studying Vikings through perspective. And so, yeah, like we say, this can provide us with something interesting. Now, what's really interesting about kind of the Arab interaction with Scandinavia and the Rus Vikings is that there actually was a vast interaction. Archaeological evidence of Arabic silver has shown that 93,000 Arabic coins from the 10th century are found in Scandinavia. 86,000 in Sweden, particularly in a place called Gotland, 7,000 in Denmark, 600 in Norway. And so, Ibn Fadlan's trading party, or his delegation, seeing the Rus, this wasn't necessarily a unique or new thing. It wasn't as if they've discovered these, this kind of new tribe of people. There is actually a vast interaction between them. Now, what's interesting as well is Ibn Fadlan describes that there are groups of 10 and 20. Now, based on his writing, these groups would have contained numerous slaves, meaning that there could be up to 100 merchants or craftsmen. Now, large cemeteries surrounding trading settlements have shown that this is pretty much true, that there was trading parties in groups, in different groups of 10 and 20, up to 1,000 people. We see that most prominently in the infamous Burka settlement that provides us with about 500 to 1,000 graves, meaning that Fadlan's claim that there could be up to 100 traders, even more, is not entirely exaggerated and is highly plausible. What's really interesting as well is that in a later passage he writes about a chieftain who is there with the merchants, and therefore if the Rus are kind of together in this kind of group of 10 and 20, what's really interesting, it shows an element of social equality. Fadlan doesn't really point out a specific character, specific leader until much later on. And we know that from the second half of the 9th century, there was kind of a social equity or equality amongst Vikings, especially in small towns and communities, which is why Ibn Fadlan cannot identify a definitive hierarchy, which is really, really interesting and provides such an insight into kind of the different ways that kind of societies interact, and not only interact but form as well, because of course Ibn Fadlan comes from a very strict society, both religiously and culturally, where there is definitive hierarchies, and so it's kind of this fluidity meets, I guess, conservative kind of strict boundaries. But what's really interesting is that Ibn Fadlan discusses slaves, but he's not really fazed by it. This is very interesting because it's really interesting. It's funny because he gets so caught up about their hygiene and their cleanliness, but they have slaves to trade is just an everyday thing. Now, what this kind of shows us is that slavery has been around for centuries. In the medieval era, in the classical era, slaves are, you could even say, the founding blocks of civilization. The reason why people are able to build fast civilizations is primarily on the backs of slaves. And so we see, although there's cultural differences, there's also a cultural connection. Now, the Rus would trade slaves even with the Middle Eastern caliphs. And what we understand is that, these were slaves that the Rus would have captured from Eastern Europe, from their raiding seasons around Scandinavia and the Baltic, maybe even from as far as England or Iceland. And so what's really interesting is that, that their kind of treatment, their kind of slave trade that they are involved with. But what separates them with slaves is how the Rus treat their slaves, because Ibn Fadlan describes the beauty of these women who will be traded, but then recounts how the Rus have intercourse with them in full view of everyone. And while slaves lack kind of a representation in archaeology, so it's kind of a little bit difficult to verify. Trading with slaves, as we've said, is mentioned as a commodity throughout Europe, and Ibn Rusta, another kind of Persian cartographer, similar to Ibn Fadlan, also writes that that the Rus communities sail their ships to ravage surrounding Slavs, bring back captives whom they sell to the Khazaran, the Bulgars, and they have sex with them. Quite a blunt kind of description. But nevertheless, what's really interesting is kind of how slaves were kind of subject to the will of their masters, really, which included, sadly, unlimited sexual gratification whilst on voyage. It is notable, actually, that Ibn Fadlan uses intercourse. Now, obviously, that could have just been the way in which the person who translated and edited it chose that word. But what's really interesting, though, is that I guess that it was intercourse rather than rape or forced sex, which shows potentially a willingness, an empowerment on the slave's behalf, which again feeds back into that social equity and social equality in the Rus. We see obviously later in a passage about the which is probably one of the most famous passages from Ibn Fadlan, which is about the burial ritual of a chieftain, that slaves are interwoven within Viking culture. When a chieftain dies, a group of, I guess you could say, nobles will ritualistically have sex with slaves who are most probably somewhat drugged, maybe not, but who are then killed and placed on the boat, which is then burned with the chieftain. But what's I guess interesting is that obviously this really counters Muslim cultural practices and experiences. This kind of social equity and fluidity you wouldn't really experience in the Middle East. And we see that as well with the fact that there is this description of group sex. The Vikings provide a really interesting example of kind of fluidity and in terms of sexuality and gender that we see in kind of many other Christian and Muslim communities. We see that obviously it's very unfamiliar to Ibn Fadlan, who is disgusted by this because he comes from the Abbasid Caliphate that that has these firm concepts of sexuality and gender. But it's really interesting in terms of LGBT history, that there are examples of this kind of fluid culture. A thousand years ago. Now, what's really interesting as well is that obviously we get a vast amount of our sources about Vikings from people who have been affected by them, the victims, you could say. For instance, Alcuin, or the Annals of Sombertan, which describe the Viking raids. Now, Ibn Fadlan provides, I guess, quite an interesting contrast to the typical Viking literature, because he expresses certain opinions which underpin cultural differences, but which aren't expressed by Christian sources. For instance, he begins the passage by depicting the Rus Vikings as the dirtiest, the filthiest of all Allah's creatures, regarding their lack of modesty when urinating and defecating and having intercourse. Now, archaeological evidence in Anglo-Scandinavian York has demonstrated that Viking communities did live in unhygienic conditions, which was the norm of Viking culture. And this contrasts Fadlan's Abbasid culture of being a devout Muslim, where he would wash and groom and pray 5 times a day, marry before having intercourse, have modesty, and I guess what we would call nowadays this conservative outlook. But what is really interesting is that, unlike Christian sources like the Annals of Sombertan, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, or etc., etc., Ibn Fadlan does not call them pagan or heathen. Historically, the Rus shared the same Norse faith as Scandinavia, and would later adopt Christianity in 988. And so this is a good 50 years or so before that happens. Now, the difference, obviously, between Christian sources and Ibn Fadlan is kind of trade and war. Christianity experienced primarily piracy, invasion, kind of capture, destruction, rape, all these different things from the Vikings. Whereas on the Silk Road, and the East, the Abbasids have really only seen, I guess, economic and political advantage in trading along the Silk Road, kind of hiring the Rus for their own wars, and so what becomes apparent is that there is a degree of mitigation regarding opposing religions, which is why pagan and heathen are not used. There is, of course, cultural difference, but the kind of opinions, the perceptions between these two cultures are kind of mutual, rather than the kind of Christian perception, which is that Vikings are raiders, rapists, and thieves, you could say, and destroyers of civilization. But that's what's really interesting, is that obviously Ibn Fadlan provides us with a really kind of, I guess, mitigated view. But, I mean, does that mean that it's less biased than those Christian sources? When we see, say, Alcuin writing about, these heathen pagans, and how, like dragons and serpents and, the clouds darken and God's wrath is, where when we compare that to Ibn Fadlan, who just talks about how he was repulsed by their unhygienicness, does it mean that he is a more accurate source in understanding Rus and Viking culture? Who knows? I mean, that's up to kind of the individual, I guess. But this extract certainly provides us with a brilliant microcosm of the kind of multiculturalism, the interaction between cultures that happened along the Silk Road and in the medieval world. Really, recent archaeology supports these various claims made by Ibn Fadlan, supports this kind of idea of multiculturalism, and Ibn Fadlan's discussion of cultural traditions, trading processes, religious practices is really, I guess, more insightful than understanding Viking culture and society than, I guess, the pillaging pirates that the Danes are, in terms of kind of Christian sources. Therefore, I think it's really important to counterbalance these emotive Christian sources with these kind of Eastern Arab sources. And this is why I guess we have to really push to decolonize the curriculum, because it allows for a much more balanced view. If we had just taken the Christian sources, then it paints the Vikings in a massively different picture. And so by being able to compare and contrast all these different examples, then it can really give us a big picture of what these communities look like. So thank you very much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed. Do take note and really think about the fact that Europe wasn't as divided and perhaps isolated as we may portray it. Obviously, we are human and we like to categorize and separate and distinguish things, but do remember that obviously all these things are ultimately interconnected, which is really important in studying medieval history, to know that Jewish, Muslim and Christian communities intermingled with other communities such as pagan ones like the Norse. But there we go. Thank you ever so much for watching. Do watch the previous videos, and as any other YouTuber says, like, subscribe, share it with your mates, do all that stuff. Thank you very much. See you next time.